What's up, Tesla family? It's Ray J back with another video. And in this one, I want to break down what's happening with Tesla, SPY, Nvidia, the QQQ, and a couple of other tickers. I'm also going to break down why tomorrow is going to be a very important day for the markets as we have Nvidia's earnings, not to mention other factors for us going forward. But just note that I am not a financial planner, so take nothing I say as financial advice. And don't forget to smash the like button. Anyways, for the markets, I just want to mention that we saw some very interesting volatility. Many ETFs like SPY and the QQQ are very range bound. Right now, they're holding support but still getting rejected at resistance. And Tesla, on the other hand, is showing some weakness right now. And that's the unfortunate truth about what I'm seeing so far. So the question is, what on earth are the very important levels to watch for on Tesla? What's likely going to happen, in my opinion? How are things looking in my personal opinion as well? So from the way Tesla has been moving, just looking at price action alone, Tesla pushed up to 228, came down, made a lower high, came down, made a lower high. We actually made a lower low here, then we made a lower high, then we made another lower low. So the overall structure is bearish. We're looking bearish on Tesla. We're continuing to dump. We're getting a lot of negative headlines. There was some news about Ross Gerber reducing his position by over 60 million Tesla shares, which is a pretty big position. Not the best of news for us. And then there was also that news involving, the Canadian tariffs being imposed on Chinese EVs affecting Tesla. So all this bad news has been coming out, and the share price has been a little bit lackluster, at least for the last couple of days. Now, whether or not this continues will depend on Nvidia's earnings, but approaching it, we are still looking pretty weak. So the question is, when is Nvidia's earnings? When is all this going to play out? So let me first talk about that data and such before I start breaking down the charts. So, as a quick reminder, tomorrow is Wednesday, August 28th, 2024. Please note that we have some mortgage data in the morning, but it's very, very minor. Everything is very minor that's coming out tomorrow for data. We do have at 11:30 a.m. the 17-week bill auction, and then just Bostic giving a speech from the Fed. But everything is minor. I'm not really too worried about data. For the way the market's looking in terms of sentiment, we're still neutral as the market is range bound. Momentum is still at greed because the market is still at a high valuation. So the S&P 500 is close to all-time highs. That's why we're still at greed. But the current trend is still technically sideways. The market is still trading sideways right now. For other things out there, the puts and call option positioning is at greed. It's still stuck at this 0.7 ratio. Are we about to see a big surge in puts and the market starts dipping as this goes up because of Nvidia dumping things? Or are we about to see the opposite? Is this going to continue to dip all the way down to our lows from July? We just have to wait and see. Nothing can be promised. Nothing is guaranteed quite yet. We just have to wait. And I think that the market's just waiting for Nvidia's earnings to be the next catalyst to cause a very, very big move. Now, volatility is neutral. The VIX is also waiting to see what happens with Nvidia, so we're going to be very patient with this nonetheless. So when is Nvidia's earnings tomorrow? It's going to be tomorrow after the market closes, and this is going to be huge for the markets. In the morning tomorrow, we have some minor retail like Kohl's and Foot Locker announcing their earnings, and then Nvidia's earnings is going to be a big one after the market closes. Why is Nvidia so important? Well, the answer is it's becoming one of the most important stocks because it's worth hundreds of billions of dollars and has its hands in so many different industries. When it comes to semiconductors, they're pivotal for so many industries from like Tesla to the EV sector, and the list goes on for all the different areas that they affect. But Tesla's going to be a very, very big partner of Nvidia. Of course, Tesla gets their GPUs from Nvidia. They have tens of thousands of them for their orders, and more AI chips continuing to be ordered. On top of that, Tesla's been working to build its supercomputer and AI training with NVIDIA's chips. They are assisting with that in FSD and a bunch of other things like that. So I think that whatever happens to NVIDIA will affect Tesla. If NVIDIA dumps, Tesla will likely follow it. And if the opposite happens, Tesla will likely do the same thing. But that's just one aspect about how this is going to affect things. So one thing you have to remember is that two things are dictating the market: algorithms and then manipulation based off what these market makers want to do. So this is just a big thing you need to remember. The market is full of noise, and the market is just using that noise as an excuse to allow these market makers to do what's advantageous for them. What does that mean? So if Nvidia does very good with earnings, right, they could find a reason to pump the share price. Nvidia alone is not pumping the whole markets. They could start pumping SPY, the QQQ, Tesla, and everything if Nvidia does very, very well. They use that as an excuse to pump things to their advantage. But the same thing happens vice versa. If Nvidia does very, very poorly, or if maybe a lot of things are good but one thing is off, they could use that as an excuse to dump the share price, and then they'll use that as a reason to dump Tesla, dump SPY, the QQQ, and do what's more advantageous for them. So it depends on what they want to do. We'll have to see how things end up developing for Nvidia. Of course, their earnings are important. We are expecting basically a lot of shifts over here when it comes to what they tell us. One thing worth mentioning is the fact that we're going to be looking for a fourth straight quarter of triple digit growth, but at a reduced pace of about 112% to about $28.7 billion. The forecast for the October quarter is also expecting about a growth of 75% to about 31.7 billion. So we're looking for optimistic guidance and what else they tell us about their H200 chip and a bunch of other things like that. So I'll be talking more about this later on. But look for EPS revenue guidance and a bunch of things like that and what they announce about their products. That's going to be very important. So it's going to have a big effect on the markets in Tesla. Tesla had some negative news. I already went over the news in my earlier video, so I'm not going to go over it right now. But just note that volume is at 62 million overall, a little bit below average. Short volume started going up since yesterday, and that's no surprise for why Tesla is dipping. And then Baird and Piper Sandler gave Tesla an outperform rating, thinking Tesla will outperform. I think approaching the October robotaxi events, Tesla has potential to bounce, but as of right now, we've shifted more in favor of the bears for the time being, right? Just for now. Now, the price-price ratio is dipping. Tesla's losing some strength. And then historically, Wednesdays are green only about 48% of the time. And we tend to see more volatility at open and also during 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So look for volatility then. So that being said, what do I see for the market moving forward? What is my prediction for Tesla? Let me talk about that now. So for the time being, we're going to be watching some very, very key levels on Tesla. Basically, Tesla got this very, very big looking structure right here. We have this low that was broken at this 210 area. And like I said before, we're making lower highs, lower lows, lower highs, lower lows, lower highs, and lower lows, continuing to fall. I believe that Tesla is going to likely dip down to our support. We're going to be looking at the lows from today to see if we could hold that. If we lose that, Tesla's at risk of dipping all the way down to this imbalance, which would take us down to 202. And if we get rebought, if we see buyers step in for Tesla, you want to see it break past 212. 210 will be resistance, 212, then 215. 212 at the very least needs to get bought back up for us to try to turn. Otherwise, we look more bearish. But nonetheless, Tesla is bearish. We're making lower highs and lower lows. We're dipping, and we favor downside for tomorrow for the time being. Now, here's how I think it's going to go. I'm not saying it's going to last forever, but remember, the market's going to be open. We're going to have trading, and then the market closes, and then we have Nvidia's earnings. So I think when the market's open, Tesla may dip a little bit. We might be looking for testable lows from today. If that does not hold, Tesla could dip even more. I'll be looking at 205 and 202 as the main supports if we end up losing our key support. So watch for that very carefully to see how well Tesla holds up. But there is a risk of this dipping a little bit more. Part of why I say that is also because of the fact that we have this downtrend and also because of the fact that the daily is looking a little bit weaker too. So it looks a little bit more bearish, and the daily 200 EMA is also around that 205, 206 area. So we look weaker on the daily, and Tesla is dipping. So I do favor downside a little bit more. So with that being said, we might dip a little bit tomorrow morning, but then whether or not this continues depends on Nvidia's earnings. So watch for that very carefully. Now, SPY is very different from Tesla. We have a nice range on SPY. What do I mean by that? When we hit 555 and sometimes 558, SPY gets bought back up. And when we hit 562 to 563 around that area, we tend to get sold off. So we're just trading sideways. Look at the direction. We're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, pretty much between supply and demand. So for now, our support is going to be close to our 20 EMA around the 559 area and also the low of the day today. And then if we lose that, I'll be looking for 556 around that area. Losing that turns us more bearish. If we're bullish, we want to be looking for 562 as resistance, followed by the imbalance towards 560. Basically, the imbalance all the way up to 563. I presume what's going to happen tomorrow is we dip a little bit. We might be retesting our 20 EMA around the 559. Then we get bought back up and just consolidate. I think we're going to see a lot of consolidation. And then whether or not we see a big break depends on Nvidia's earnings. So if Nvidia pumps things, SPY has potential to break the highs and start pushing for a new all-time high to 565 and above that. If we're bearish, Nvidia gives us the rug pull, we're going to be looking for a break below 555, and this could be dipping. There's a possible slanted head and shoulders like structure that could play out, but it all depends on Nvidia's earnings. So for now, tomorrow morning, the market may dip a little bit, then consolidates. Look for a lot of sideways price action between 558 and 562. And then Nvidia's earnings will come out after the market closes. That will determine if we get a big bounce or not. Wait for the after hours to see that. ES looks a little bit weaker as well. Now, we also have a range, however. Every time we hit 5650, we reject. If we break that, we're going up to the 5700s. And every time we hit around 5600 flat, we dip. If we lose that, we'll be dipping to 5550. So we're kind of range bound, going back and forth and back and forth. I think we may dip a little bit to this imbalance towards 5625. Then we may just consolidate going back and forth as well. Now, there's a possible head and shoulders. We have like a left shoulder here, a head, maybe a right shoulder that could be forming. But I don't know for sure which way it's going to go because, like I said before, I'm not really a fortune teller. I don't know what Nvidia is going to give us. So I presume tomorrow we're going to be dipping down to the lower 5600s. Then we get bought back up and just continue to trade sideways. And then Nvidia will determine if we get a big break in one direction. Now, looking at Nvidia, we technically have a decent looking structure as we've been trying to make higher highs compared to before. So we are still holding up nicely. But the issue with Nvidia is for the last couple of days, despite that structure developing, we have a range that's developing, and this kind of tells us that anything could go with it. So what I mean is, Nvidia, every time we hit the 130 area, we reject. We have 3 rejections off 130, but every time we hit 123 to 124.5, we get bought back up. We went back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We're range bound, unfortunately. We may dip a little bit towards 126.9 tomorrow, maybe a little bit lower. Then we get bought back up from 126 to 128. I presume we're going to be trading sideways tomorrow. Now, once we get earnings, that's going to cause the big move, which is going to affect the whole market. If they pump Nvidia and we break 132, we're going to be looking for 135. If we lose 123, we're going to be looking for a big dump after earnings. Otherwise, I see us consolidating. So we consolidate tomorrow morning, and then we'll see what happens with the earnings. It might cause a big move. We'll have to just wait and see. Bitcoin has been dumping. We have 60,000 as resistance and 58,000 as our main supports. We are looking kind of weak, but I think we're going to rebound a little bit to about 60,000 to 60,500 and then consolidate. But with this dump on Bitcoin, this can mean two things. They're either getting liquidity ready for a big pump in the markets tomorrow, or it could be that the whole market's about to dump and Bitcoin is leading the way. It could go either way. This doesn't guarantee anything. I've seen scenarios where Bitcoin dumped and the market went either way. So we just have to wait and see. But this might pump a little bit, then start dipping because we are a little bit oversold on Bitcoin. Like I said about Tesla, we're looking a little bit more bearish, going back to NQ, just like Tesla. And this is, I think, what's helping to dictate Tesla as well. This is another big factor for why Tesla's dipping. The whole NASDAQ is also slowing down. If you look at the NASDAQ, NQ mini futures, we're also seeing a downtrend that's developing as we're making lower highs right over here. Now, to turn back up, you want to break past 19,700. If Nvidia does good on earnings, we could be pushing to 20,000 plus. And for bearish, you want to see it lose this 200 EMA at 19,400. If that breaks, we're going to be looking for a dump back down to this imbalance. Technically speaking, we look bearish. We have a head and shoulders like structure. We do favor downside, but there's no confirmation of us losing key support, so it could go either way. Going into tomorrow, I think we could be dipping towards 19,500, the lower area, and then consolidate. And then we'll see if we continue to see the measure move down. It depends on Nvidia's earnings. For the QQQ, we're making lower highs right now. We're continuing to dump. And just like NQ, we have the same setup as that's dictating us. We have a left shoulder here, a head, and maybe a right shoulder forming. And this favors downside. But look what happened today. We hit 472, the 50 EMA, the yellow line you see here. Then we got bought back up. But then instead of continuing to squeeze, what happened? We came back down. We failed to break resistance, and then we ended up dipping back down. So tomorrow we might dip towards 473, get bought back up and consolidate. And whether or not we get a bounce depends on Nvidia's earnings. Will Nvidia launch us above 480 into like these new highs, or will we get a big rug pull and lose 472? If we lose 472, that's confirmation. And this should be dipping to at least 468 and 464 for a big dump. So it depends on Nvidia's earnings. So watch it very carefully, but know that the NASDAQ and QQQ are looking more bearish, technically speaking. For Aapl, we are technically forming a divergence, but this is holding up very nicely. If we hold above 228, this could be pushing for 230. If we lose 226, we start dipping. This looks a little bit more bullish and might dip towards 226 and bounce tomorrow and start pushing higher, but it's doing a good job at holding up, showing some strength. For a few more out there, like Palantir, we look more bearish. If we lose 30.5, we're going to be looking for a dip for the 29s. If we break past 31.34, we look for a bounce. Otherwise, this is favoring the downside direction a little bit more, in my personal opinion. For others out there, we also happen to have Supermicro, and it looks more bearish, but it depends on Nvidia's earnings. For Supermicro, this is going to make a huge move depending on Nvidia, in my opinion. Nvidia is going to be affecting the semiconductors like Supermicro. So if we're bullish, you want to see this thing break past 580, and for bearish, we're looking for a dip below 520, taking us down to the balance at about 510. We look bearish from a technical standpoint, so I presume we're going to be dipping down to at least 520, if not 510 tomorrow. I think this might dip lower tomorrow in the morning. But then once Nvidia's earnings comes out, we'll see if we get a bounce or not. This is going to follow Nvidia. It's just playing a game of catch up. So we'll see. We'll have to see what Nvidia gives us. But this looks more bearish from a technical standpoint. So we'll see how things go. For Rivian's trying to rebound right over here. It's actually looking more bullish. I said yesterday this might dip towards the 14 area, then try to rebound, and that's what happened thus far. We look like we might try to push for 14.7. But if we were to lose 13.8, we turn back down. So I favor a little bit more upside, but whether or not we continue to fill these imbalances in the higher 14s depends on Nvidia's earnings. So we'll see how things go. For SoFi, we're trying to uptrend right here. We're going to be looking for basically 7.8 and eventually this $8 area. If we lose 7.5 at our 20 EMA, we may be dipping back down to 7.26. So it depends on a lot of different factors. But I presume that looking at the way the chart is looking, we could be pushing for this 7.8 area. We might go a little bit higher, and we'll see if we reject or not, depending on how things end up going. But I'll be watching this very, very carefully. I think we may push a little bit higher depending on Nvidia's earnings, and then we'll see how we react to resistance. For the IWM Russell 2000, I see a little dip possibly coming as we're approaching our key supports. We have 220 resistance, and then 217 to 216 is our support zone. I think what's going to happen is we dip to 217 to 216. We either hit the 20 EMA at 217 or we go a little bit lower to where this trend line happens to be. But every time we hit this, we do rebound. So it might hit this and try to rebound temporarily tomorrow. So it might be a dip and then a bounce just for tomorrow. And then that's before Nvidia's earnings, by the way. I think that's going to happen. And then once Nvidia's earnings comes out, we will see if we dump down to the lower 210s or if we get a big bounce. I see us dipping a little bit, and then we'll see what the reaction happens to be. For AMD, I just want to say that we're kind of rejecting off this trend line right here. We are basically at 149. If we lose that, we'll be dipping all the way down towards 145. And we have resistance at 152. If that breaks, we turn back up. To me, it looks a little bit weaker. We are consolidating right now on AMD, but this is going to make a massive move depending on Nvidia's earnings. Might come down a little bit. I could be looking for a test of about 147. Might dip a little bit and consolidate, and then Nvidia is going to cause a massive move. So honestly, guys, I'm not too worried about what happens in the morning tomorrow. I'm not too worried about market open tomorrow with this. What matters is going to be Nvidia's earnings, so we'll see what that leads to. For ARM, we had this bearish engulfing candle. I said typically what happens when we get bearish engulfing candles is stocks rebound before they possibly continue lower. And we rebounded a little bit. Now we're starting to dip. So I think that we might be retesting 129.5, if not lower. And we'll see what the reaction happens to be. To be bullish, you want to break past 134. To be bearish, you want to lose 128. We might rebound and then dip to 129, then consolidate. And then we'll see if we get a big rejection or not. We're kind of stuck in the middle. So we will see how things end up developing. So be very, very patient with how things are moving. The 4-hour looks a little bit weaker on ARM, and then we're going to be very, very mindful of how things are developing. For Coinbase, one thing I want to call out is the fact that we have this support over here around 192. If that fails us, we're going to be dipping for 188. And then if that fails us, we'll be looking all the way down towards 182 and the gap fill down to 179. For resistance, you're going to be looking for 203. If that breaks, we turn back up. What I think is happening is coin is looking a little bit weaker. It might rebound in the morning because of Bitcoin to retest 197, and we'll see if it continues lower. I presume it might rebound here, then continue back down to 192. And if Nvidia doesn't do well, we could be dipping down to fill this gap. So that's going to be a risk for this, but that depends on Nvidia. I do want to say it looks weaker, technically speaking, so look for a rebound and a dip. And then it hasn't lost critical support yet, so I'm not too bearish. It looks a little bit more bearish in terms of direction, so we'll see how that goes. Now, for Amazon, we look more weak right now. I could be looking for a dip down to the 170 area. To be bullish, you want to break past 174 and 176, but this is favoring downside a little bit more. Now, whether or not the downside comes depends on Nvidia's earnings, but it does favor it coming down to the low 170s. So we'll see what that ends up leading to. We may dip a little bit to the lower 170s tomorrow before we see the move. For Meta, this looks a little bit more bearish because we popped a bit only to reject. We need to hold above 524 to turn bullish. Otherwise, we're going to be dipping to 515. I favor it's going to be dipping to 515 tomorrow. Then we'll see what the reaction happens to be. We may dip a little bit to 515, maybe a little bit lower, and then we'll see if we bounce or not, depending on Nvidia's earnings. For Microsoft, we're just range bound right now. The market is just waiting on the edge for Nvidia. That's why we're seeing a lot of these tech stocks just consolidating. Even Microsoft is consolidating. We have this 410 area as support and 414 as resistance. We're just trading back and forth. I think we're gonna be dipping to 410 and just consolidate. There's not really much going on with this. All day it's been consolidating. Even for the past like 2.5 days, it's just been consolidation. So I might consolidate, but I do see an imbalance down here around 408 that might take us lower. So we're going to consolidate, maybe dip a little bit depending on Nvidia. So we'll see. Google looks a little bit weaker. It is going to be testing, I think, 165 tomorrow, and then we'll see if it bounces. But this will depend on Nvidia. So look for a little bit of a dip, and then we'll see how Nvidia affects this. With that being said, DJT came down to 20 as we predicted. The 20s were coming. We looked more bearish. We'll be watching to see if it gets closer to about 25, and we'll see what the reaction happens to be. The VIX, we had this very, very interesting looking structure. We had this head and shoulders like structure has developed. It may dip a little bit tomorrow morning, but then we'll be watching to see, does the VIX get a big bounce as we get closer to 14, or do we get a big rug pull? This will depend on Nvidia's earnings. I don't know for sure, guys. The VIX could go either way, so don't be too confident. And the head and shoulders is not everything. We'll just have to be patient with this. The 10 years is going to make a big move depending on the GDP data and such, and the dollar is at support. What concerns me about the markets is that that's the dollar's at 100. This is where the dollar has key support. Will it bounce because of Nvidia, or will it dump? We'll have to wait and see. So nonetheless, guys, Tesla's looking more bearish for now. Okay, it may dip a little bit tomorrow, but whether or not that continues, okay, I'm just talking about tomorrow specifically. Whether this continues depends on Nvidia's earnings. If Nvidia does very well, Tesla could see a huge bounce, or it could see a big dump if Nvidia doesn't do well. For now, approaching Nvidia's earnings, we look a little bit more bearish, and then we'll see what happens once they make their big announcement. So Nvidia is going to be key for tomorrow, whatever Jensen Huang has to say. Let's just hope for the best and be very, very patient. But just with that being said, the market's on the edge getting ready for their earnings, and we're going to be very, very patient nonetheless just to see how it goes. I'll be back tomorrow to give you guys another update. Thank you so much for listening, and peace out.